I'd like to talk just briefly about income taxes. Those of you who have had the opportunity to read the Constitution of the United States of America recognize the federal government was not given the right to produce income taxes. Taxes were apportioned. The way it worked was simple. The federal government or the Congress would determine what was needed, whether we to pay for the Army or a project to build a fort or whatever it might be. They would determine the nature of the project, the cost of the project, and divide the cost among the various states and send the states a bill. When it worked best, they sent the states a bill saying, if you pay early, we will charge you less. If we don't get the money on time, we'll charge you a penalty. And that worked very well because the states resisted the need to collect taxes from their citizens. After all, they were sovereign. The federal government was only meant to be a helper to the states. Now that's been reversed, but the fact was in those days the states were in charge. Now, under the apportionment system, once a project was finished, there was no more need for money, the case was closed. So we didn't have continuing costs except for the Navy. Army was financed every year separately. We didn't have continuing costs except for the Navy. And there was no need for an income tax because the money that was collected as taxes on imports and exports easily covered the federal budget for its legitimate purposes. Then in 1913, the Federal Reserve was established and the income tax was established in order to pay interest to the Federal Reserve for the funding money they were going to create. The politicians loved it because now they were unlimited in the amount of money they could use to buy influence or to line their own pockets, and the banks were happy because they were protected by the government in their relationship. Just think about the intrusive way the federal IRS handles things. There's a fraud penalty if a person doesn't pay his taxes correctly. 75% of the taxes due. So if you owe $1,000, they could charge you $1,750. They also can and do charge interest on both the original tax bill and the penalty. There's a failure to pay fine, and that's 20%. There's a fine for substantially understating the taxes owed. There's a fine for not paying the estimated taxes on time, the quarterly estimated taxes. The federal government, the IRS, reserves the right to confiscate anything, including your home, in payment of your bills. So they create a lot of fear in this country. They also reserve what they think is the right to invade our privacy, to see everything we do, to make sure that we're not cheating on the taxes. What's ironic is people from other countries laugh at Americans because they try to avoid the taxes in their own nations as much as they can. Here, we think it's a patriotic duty and pay them willingly. It's still a robbery because we're not paying for legitimate purposes. You can complain to the IRS, but when you complain to the thief who robbed you, you really don't have much a chance. It's a very complicated and expensive process, and they determine in the end whether they will honor your request or not. In fact, year after year, the IRS charges people for taxes they do not owe. And in most cases, the people pay those taxes because they're afraid that if they respond with, I don't owe you the money, that the consequences will be worse. When you get an audit, chances are it's a computer-generated audit. You will answer the questions that come, they will ask more questions. They will ask you more questions, you answer the questions, they'll ask you more questions, you answer the questions. They do it until they wear you out and finally pay the bill, even though they know you didn't owe the money in the first place. That's generally how promotions are produced in the IRS. People who can squeeze the hardest, the taxpayer, and get away with it, whether the bill is legitimate or not. Just one little tip. Sometimes people say, well, I have a little business. I can use my home office as a tax deduction. But just watch out, because the tax deduction will not be honored unless the majority of the business you do is done in your house. So be careful of that kind of a deduction. There are many other things you can do to reduce taxes legitimately and not put yourself in jeopardy. I hope this has been helpful.